But I am willing to make a deal with you, a test, if you will. Prove to us that you are worthy, and I will allow your people to join the stars. Fail, and your species will be discarded. Carter's heart raced. A test. What kind of test? He wasn't prepared for this. What kind of test? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The Arkan woman's lips curved into a faint smile, though it was anything but comforting. It is simple, she said. You will not break the deal. You will do as you are told, without question and without hesitation. If you do so, we may allow you to live. If not, your world will be destroyed. There are no second chances, human. Carter's mind raced. He had heard rumors of other species that had been wiped out by the Arkan for failing their tests, but he never imagined that he, of all people, would be placed in such a situation. You will accept this challenge, she continued, her golden eyes glowing with intensity. You have no choice. The fate of your people is in your hands. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, as if the very fabric of reality was bending under the weight of her words. Carter's hands tightened into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't show weakness now, not in front of these powerful beings. He swallowed, then nodded. I accept your terms, he said, his voice resolute. The woman tilted her head, as if appraising him, before turning away. She motioned for the others to follow her, and the group began to walk toward a large structure in the distance, something that resembled a temple, but far more advanced and intricate than anything humans had ever built. You will follow, the woman said, her tone final, and you will not fail. As they began walking toward the temple, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led into a trap. The pressure of the situation was mounting with every step he took, and he realized that this was no longer just a diplomatic mission. It was a battle for the survival of humanity. And one thing was clear, the Arkan were not going to make it easy. The temple loomed ahead as Commander James Carter walked behind the Arkan woman. The structure was unlike anything he had ever seen. Tall, angular, and shimmering in a way that almost seemed otherworldly. It looked as though it had been crafted not just with advanced technology, but with an understanding of physics that humanity had only begun to explore. The walls pulsed with a faint, glowing light, and the air around it felt charged, as if the temple itself was alive. The woman, who still hadn't given him her name, led the way, her steps graceful and measured, as though she were already certain of the outcome. Carter's mind raced. He had accepted the test, but he had no idea what to expect. What did she mean by the deal? What kind of challenge had he agreed to? And why had they picked him to represent all of humanity? His crew followed closely behind him. Lieutenant Patel, his communications officer, kept glancing nervously at the Arkan as they walked. Carter could tell she was just as unsettled as he was. It wasn't just the technology and the eerie atmosphere. It was the way the Arkan made you feel. There was no warmth, no sign of friendship, only cold calculation. These were beings whose power far exceeded anything the humans had ever encountered, and Carter had no idea what kind of test he was about to face. As they entered the temple, the air grew heavier, and the space inside was massive, stretching upward in impossible ways. It felt as though they had stepped into a different dimension. The walls were lined with intricate carvings that seemed to shift as they moved past, telling stories of ancient Arkan history. But Carter didn't have time to examine them closely. He had more important things on his mind. The Arkan woman led them to a large circular chamber at the center of the temple. A huge stone pedestal stood in the middle, illuminated by a glowing light that seemed to come from nowhere. On top of the pedestal, a small dark object rested. It looked like a cube, about the size of a human fist, and it was surrounded by an aura of energy that hummed softly. Carter's instincts screamed at him to be cautious. Everything about this situation felt wrong. But the woman's presence was overwhelming, and he didn't want to show any weakness. She stopped in front of the pedestal and turned to face him, her golden eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, It felt as though she could see right through him. The stars above Earth had always fascinated Commander James Carter. He'd grown up staring at the night sky, wondering what it would be like out there, far from home, surrounded by the unknown. Now, years later, he was standing at the edge of the universe, not in awe, but in a state of nervous anticipation. His ship, the Resolute, was floating in the vast emptiness of space, orbiting an alien planet no human had ever seen before. This was the most dangerous mission of his career, and it had only just begun. His crew had been sent to negotiate with the aliens of this distant world. They were known as the Orcs, an advanced species with technology that far surpassed anything humans had ever developed. The Orcs had made contact with Earth several months ago, offering peaceful trade relations, but with one warning. They didn't trust humanity. Commander Carter was tasked with ensuring the negotiations went smoothly. However, no one on Earth knew exactly why the Orcs were so cautious or so cold toward human beings. Carter stood at the bridge of the Resolute, looking out at the endless black of space. The planet below was a beautiful shade of blue and green, but something about it felt wrong. There was an unease in the air, as if the very atmosphere of the planet itself was sending a warning to anyone who might try to approach it. "Commander, we're receiving a signal," his communications officer, Lieutenant Patel, said with a calm, steady voice. Carter turned his attention to the console in front of him. The signal was encrypted, but it wasn't hard to tell it was coming from the surface of the planet. It was an invitation, no, a command. "Prepare the shuttle, Lieutenant. We're going down," Carter said, trying to sound confident. Inside, however, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. The shuttle ride was quiet, the hum of the engines the only sound in the small craft. Carter and his team of 3 were preparing for the unknown. The planet's atmosphere was dense, and the gravity was slightly stronger than Earth's. But it wasn't the physical environment that worried him. It was the Orcs. They landed in a large open clearing. The air smelled different, thick, almost metallic. The grass underfoot was a dark, almost black shade of green, and the sky was an eerie purple. Carter stepped out of the shuttle, his boots crunching on the ground. He adjusted his uniform, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He wasn't just here to represent Earth. He was here to ensure humanity's future among the stars. The Orcs were waiting. Carter could see them from a distance, standing at the edge of the clearing, their tall, slender forms silhouetted against the strange purple sky. There were 6 of them, all dressed in flowing, shimmering robes. Their faces were partially obscured by intricate, glowing masks that seemed to pulse with a faint light. Their eyes, however, were visible, and they burned with an intensity that made Carter's skin crawl. As he and his team approached, one of the Orcs stepped forward. She was taller than Carter, her long, silver hair cascading down her back, and her eyes, bright, almost unnatural shades of gold, were fixed on him. "You are the human?" she asked, her voice calm, yet commanding. It wasn't the first time Carter had heard an alien speak in perfect English, but the way she said it felt different, like she was testing him, as if his very presence was being scrutinized. "Yes," Carter replied, trying to sound confident. "Commander James Carter. I represent the people of Earth." The Orcan woman looked him up and down, her gaze piercing. There was a brief silence, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Then she spoke again. "I have heard much about your species," she said slowly, her voice colder now. "You are reckless, stubborn, and often dangerous. Yet, you have a unique quality that intrigues us." Carter felt a chill run down his spine. Was this a compliment or a threat? He tried to remain calm, but something in her tone made him uneasy. The last thing he wanted to do was provoke her. "We have come in peace," he said, choosing his words carefully. "We want to establish a mutually beneficial relationship between our worlds." The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, her long, elegant fingers brushing against the air. It was as if she was feeling the atmosphere around them, testing it for some unseen force. Carter could see the slight shimmer in the air around her hands. It was clear she was using some kind of advanced technology or ability, something beyond his understanding. Finally, she spoke again, her voice now firm and unyielding. "I do not trust you, human," she said, her words cutting through the silence. "This is the deal, Commander Carter," she said, her voice cold and commanding. "This cube is a test. If you can unlock it and understand its purpose, you will prove your worth. If you cannot, the consequences will be dire. This is not a game. Your people's fate is tied to your success or failure." Carter's heart pounded. He stared at the cube. It didn't look dangerous, but looks could be deceiving. The energy surrounding it felt intense. It was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The first rule of any negotiation or challenge in space was to never underestimate what an alien species might consider simple. He took a deep breath. He had to focus. If he failed, Earth would be at risk, and everything humanity had worked for in terms of intergalactic relations would be for nothing. His hands clenched into fists, but he remained calm, stepping forward. "I understand," he said firmly, his voice betraying none of the fear he felt. "I'll take your test. I'll prove humanity is worthy of being part of the stars." The Arkan woman studied him for a long moment, her golden eyes narrowing slightly. She said nothing, but Carter could feel her measuring his every word, every action. She nodded, seemingly satisfied by his response, and gestured toward the cube. "You may begin," she said simply. Carter approached the pedestal, his boots clicking softly on the smooth stone floor. He didn't touch the cube immediately, unsure of what might happen if he did. He studied it closely, trying to determine its purpose. The object itself was solid, but the energy surrounding it was unlike anything he had ever felt. It wasn't electromagnetic. No, it was something more personal. He could feel a presence, as though the cube itself were aware of him, waiting for him to make the first move. "What exactly am I supposed to do with it?" Carter asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The Arkan woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she motioned to a large panel on the wall. It was covered in strange symbols, glowing softly with the same light as the cube. Carter felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the moment of truth. He glanced at his crew. Patel looked just as nervous as he felt. The other two members of his team, Lieutenant Hayes and Sergeant Jackson, were silent, their eyes fixed on the cube. They had no idea what to do either, but it was Carter's responsibility. He was the commander, and whatever happened next was on him. Taking a deep breath, he reached for the cube, his fingers brushing its surface. The moment he touched it, a strange sensation ran through his body. It wasn't painful, but it was unsettling. It felt like a rush of information flooding into his mind, a torrent of thoughts and images that didn't belong to him. He gasped, pulling his hand away instinctively. "What was that?" Patil asked, her voice laced with fear. The Arkan woman watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "You felt it," she said. "The cube links to your mind. It tests your intellect, your understanding of the universe. Only those who are capable of comprehending the knowledge within it will succeed." Carter tried to calm his breathing. It was clear now that this wasn't just a physical challenge. It was a mental one. The cube wasn't just a device. It was a test of his mind, his ability to think and adapt under pressure. The Arkan had made it clear. Failure meant the end of humanity's chance to join the stars. He stepped back, focusing on the glowing symbols on the wall. There had to be a pattern, some key to unlocking the cube. He scanned the symbols carefully, trying to make sense of them. They were unlike any language he had ever seen, but they were strangely familiar. They felt like something he could understand, something buried deep within him, as if his mind already knew the answer but just needed the right push. "This is about understanding, not brute force," he muttered to himself. The Arkan woman's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. She seemed to be waiting for him to make the next move. Carter turned his attention back to the cube. He had to unlock its secrets, or all would be lost. As he studied the cube again, a realization struck him. The symbols on the wall weren't just random. They formed a pattern that mirrored the energy flow of the cube. The two were connected. Carter had to think like the Archon, like they did. Their technology was built on a different set of principles, one far beyond the human understanding of mechanics and physics. It wasn't about force, it was about the flow of energy, the way it connected everything in the universe. His crew wasn't as composed. Lieutenant Patel walked with her arms crossed, a worried frown etched on her face. Lieutenant Hayes kept glancing around, his eyes darting from one symbol to another, while Sergeant Jackson's jaw was clenched, his shoulders rigid. They were all still reeling from the intensity of their individual trials. Carter knew they couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. They had made it this far, and they had to keep pushing forward. But even though he was determined, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The temple was too quiet now, almost as if it were waiting for them to make the wrong move. The Archon woman led them into yet another chamber, this one larger than the last. The ceiling soared high above them, disappearing into shadows. At the center of the room, there was a raised platform, and upon it stood a large glowing sphere. The sphere was the size of a human head, pulsating with an ethereal light that seemed to draw their eyes in, as though it were alive. Carter stepped forward, his heart pounding. The woman's voice echoed in the silence, breaking through the heavy air. "This is the next phase of your test," she said, her tone still as cold as before. "The sphere contains a decision that will determine your fate. You will each face it, and the decision you make will affect not just your own life, but the future of your people." Carter felt a chill run down his spine. This was different. He had expected another trial, another challenge. But a decision. What kind of decision would require such a powerful test? Patel stepped forward, her voice tight. What kind of decision? The Archon woman's golden eyes flickered, and for the briefest moment, Carter saw a hint of something, perhaps a flicker of amusement or recognition. But it was gone before he could make sense of it. "The decision will test your ability to sacrifice," she replied, her voice steady. "You must each choose. Sacrifice what you hold most dear, or accept the consequences of failing to do so. The sphere will show you the outcome of your decision." Carter frowned. Sacrifice. What could they possibly ask for? What could they force them to give up? Before he could speak, the sphere began to glow brighter, its light now enveloping the room. Carter raised a hand to shield his eyes from the blinding brightness. When the light faded, he saw something shocking. A figure had appeared in the center of the room. It was him, or rather, it looked like him. Carter took a step forward, his heart hammering in his chest. This figure, this copy of him, looked exactly like him, down to the smallest detail. The same sharp eyes, the same military uniform, the same posture. But there was something wrong. The figure's eyes were empty, hollow. Its expression was blank, and it stood unmoving, like a puppet frozen in place. "This is the test," the Archon woman's voice interrupted Carter's thoughts. "This version of you is a manifestation of your potential fate, a representation of your future. The decision is simple. Destroy it, and you destroy the potential version of yourself that could fail. Leave it be, and you accept that version of yourself, with all the consequences it entails." Carter's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Destroy his own future self. Was that even possible? What kind of twisted test was this? The figure before him remained still, its hollow eyes staring back at him as though waiting for him to make a choice. His mind raced, trying to process what this meant. Could he really make such a choice? Could he truly destroy a version of himself, no matter how distant it was? His gaze shifted to his crew, and he saw similar confusion in their eyes. Patel, Hayes, and Jackson were all staring at the figure as though trying to understand what it was, what it represented. The tension in the room was palpable. It was as if the entire world was hanging in the balance, waiting for someone to act. Carter clenched his fists. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand there, frozen like the copy before him. But the question gnawed at him. What did it mean to destroy his future self? Was he really capable of such an act? Would it even change anything? Was there a way to avoid sacrificing anything? "Commander," Paddle said quietly, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" His fingers hovered over the cube again, this time with purpose. He wasn't just touching it. He was connecting to it. Slowly, he placed his hand on the surface, allowing himself to feel the pulse of energy flowing through it. The symbols on the wall began to shift, aligning with the cube's energy. It was like the two were speaking to each other, communicating in a language only the cube could understand. Then, without warning, the cube hummed. A soft light enveloped it, and Carter felt the knowledge flood his mind. It wasn't just information, it was understanding. For a split second, he saw the universe from a perspective he couldn't describe. He saw the stars, the planets, the very fabric of space and time itself. He saw how everything was connected, how everything was linked together by an energy far greater than anything humans had ever known. And then, as quickly as it came, the vision was gone. Carter stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt dizzy, as though his body couldn't quite process what his mind had just experienced. "You've done it," the Arkan woman said, her voice no longer cold, but impressed. "You have passed the test, Commander Carter." Carter could barely comprehend her words. He was still reeling from the experience. The cube had unlocked something inside him, something that connected him to the universe in a way he had never imagined. But now, with the test over, he had one question left. "What happens now?" he asked, still trying to steady his breath. The Arkan woman gave him a slight smile, a rare thing, almost imperceptible. "Now you have earned the right to join the stars." After the cube glowed and Carter successfully unlocked its hidden knowledge, a strange calm fell over the temple. It wasn't like the world had stopped moving, but it felt as though time itself had paused. The air was thick with tension, and the Arkan woman's golden eyes never left him. Her gaze was no longer cold, but it still held an air of expectation, as if waiting for him to prove that his success wasn't just a fluke. Carter felt the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders. The test wasn't over. The cube may have opened its secrets to him, but the Arkan were known for their complexity. This wasn't just about passing one challenge. It was about proving humanity's worthiness in every aspect, and that included survival, intelligence, and adaptability. He turned to look at his crew. Lieutenant Patel was still staring at the pedestal where the cube had rested, clearly astonished. Lieutenant Hayes, usually the most serious of the crew, looked uncertain, as if he was trying to process what had just happened. Sergeant Jackson, on the other hand, stood rigidly by, trying to maintain his composure but clearly anxious. Carter could see their fear, but he didn't have time to comfort them. He had to focus. "I've unlocked it," Carter said, his voice steady. "But I'm guessing this isn't the end." The Arkan woman nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "No, Commander. It is only the beginning. The cube has shown you what you needed to see, but it is only a tool. The real test begins now." Carter's heart skipped a beat. He had been right all along. This wasn't just about solving riddles or cracking codes. It was something more. But what? What could be worse than the strange vision he'd experienced when he touched the cube? His mind was still reeling from the flood of knowledge, and now the Arkan were telling him that this was only the start of the challenge. "I will guide you to the next phase," the Arkan woman continued, her voice cold again, but tinged with a trace of respect. "This test will examine your resilience, your ability to survive under pressure. It will test your strength of mind and body. If you fail, your crew and your world will fall." Carter tried to keep his composure, but the weight of the woman's words was undeniable. The stakes were higher than anything he had ever imagined. There was no room for error. He turned to his team, nodding. They needed to be prepared for whatever came next, even though they had no idea what was coming. The Arkan woman led them deeper into the temple, through long corridors lined with strange, shifting symbols. The walls of the temple seemed to breathe with the energy of the cube, pulsing and vibrating in sync with their movements. It was an unnerving sensation, as though the very structure itself was alive, watching them. After a few minutes, they arrived at a large open chamber. At first, it looked like a normal room, but as Carter's eyes adjusted, he saw the change. The floor beneath their feet shifted, breaking apart and rising in strange patterns. Before he could speak, the Arkan woman turned to him and said, "This is the second phase of your test. You will each face your fears, your darkest thoughts, and your worst nightmares. Only those who remain calm will succeed." Carter's heart raced. Fears. Nightmares. He had always been a level-headed person, but what the Arkan woman described sounded like something far beyond anything he had ever experienced. He glanced at his crew again. They looked nervous, even terrified, but none of them spoke. "Are you ready, Commander?" the woman asked, her voice almost taunting. "You must face whatever the temple brings." Before Carter could respond, the ground beneath him shifted. It felt like the world was tilting, and suddenly, he was no longer standing in the temple. Instead, he was surrounded by darkness. It was absolute. No stars, no light, just the empty void. The air was cold, suffocating, and it felt like it was pressing in on him. He spun around, trying to get his bearings. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Something was wrong. He wasn't alone. He could hear whispers in the dark, faint, distant voices, all speaking at once. They weren't words, but a kind of murmur, like a chorus of thoughts he couldn't quite grasp. His breath quickened as his instincts screamed at him to find a way out. But there was no escape. Not this time. Then, out of the darkness, a figure appeared. It was a shadow at first, but then it took shape. The form of a man, tall and imposing, walked toward him. Carter froze, his heart thudding in his chest. He knew this figure. He had seen it before. It was his father. The man's face was stern, filled with disappointment, and his eyes glowed with a cold fire. "You failed, James," the figure said, his voice low and accusatory. "You never were good enough. You never made it." Carter took a step back, his hands shaking. He had always tried to live up to his father's expectations, but he had never been able to do it. The pressure, the guilt, it had always weighed on him. And now, here it was, standing before him in the form of a nightmare. His father, the ghost of his past, accusing him of failure. "You're weak," the figure continued. "You'll never be enough to save humanity. Look at you, pathetic." The words cut through Carter like a knife. He wanted to fight back, to yell, to scream that he was worthy. But the words stuck in his throat. His father's disappointed gaze felt like a prison, trapping him in the past, in his self-doubt. He clenched his fists, trying to push back the flood of memories and emotions. He couldn't let this moment break him. He had to prove to himself that he was strong, that he could handle whatever came his way. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, its voice growing louder, but Carter shook his head, forcing the image to fade. He wouldn't be trapped by this. He wouldn't let his past define him. With a deep breath, he focused on his mission, on the test, on the crew, on the fate of humanity. He let go of the past, of the pain, of the guilt, and instead focused on the here and now. He wasn't the boy he used to be. He was a commander, a leader. He could do this. Slowly, the figure faded into the darkness, and Carter found himself standing in the temple once again, his heart still pounding in his chest, but his mind clear. He had faced his fear and overcome it. He had proven to himself that he could stand tall, no matter what. The Arkan woman appeared before him once more. Her golden eyes gleamed with something new, respect perhaps, but it was hard to say. She didn't speak, only nodded, as if acknowledging his strength. "Good," she said. "You have passed the first part of the test." Carter didn't speak. He was still recovering from the ordeal, his mind racing, but he knew there was more to come. This was only the beginning. Whatever the Archon had planned next, he would face it, just as he had faced the darkness and his own fear. He turned to his crew. They, too, had to face their own trials. He could see the fear in their eyes, but also the resolve. They wouldn't back down. Together, they could get through this. Together, they would survive. The Archon woman's voice broke the silence. The test will continue, Commander. You and your crew will face greater challenges, but remember this. The greatest enemy you will face is not the darkness, not the trials, but the doubt within yourself. With that, she turned and walked deeper into the temple, and Carter knew they had no choice but to follow. The deep hum of the temple filled the air as Carter and his crew followed the Archon woman down another long hallway. The walls around them were alive, their shifting symbols casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently. Carter's thoughts were still swirling from the last phase of the test. He had faced his darkest fears, and though the experience had left him shaken, he was more determined than ever to see this through. Carter turned to look at her. He could see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty. She was just as lost as he was, but they didn't have the luxury of indecision. The Archon woman had made it clear. Their fate depended on this choice. He had to make a decision, and he had to make it now. I don't know, Carter admitted, his voice thick with frustration, but we need to be careful. If we make the wrong choice here, it could be the end. Hayes stepped forward, his face set in determination. We have to trust our instincts. It's a test, right? Maybe the key is not destroying anything. Carter nodded slowly. Hayes might be right. Maybe the true test wasn't about making the sacrifice, but about finding a way to accept the consequences of their actions without being forced into a corner. He could feel the pressure building. His entire crew, all of humanity, depended on him making the right call. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. He turned back to the figure, his gaze unwavering. The figure's hollow eyes seemed to stare right into his soul, testing his resolve. The longer he looked at it, the more it felt like the figure was mocking him, as if it knew he couldn't make the choice. Suddenly, without warning, the figure stepped forward. It moved with unnatural speed, and before Carter could react, the version of him was standing directly in front of him. It raised its hand, reaching out as if to touch his face. The contact sent a shock of cold through his body, and for a moment, it felt like the world around him was shattering. Then, without explanation, everything stopped. Carter blinked and looked around. The figure had vanished. The sphere was no longer glowing, and the room seemed quieter than before. His crew was still standing there, frozen, like they had just witnessed something impossible. The Archon woman stood in front of them, her expression unchanged. But something in her eyes was different. There was no amusement now, no cold detachment. There was something else, something almost like respect. You passed, she said simply, but the test is far from over. Carter's mind spun. What had just happened? What was that figure? And why had it vanished just like that? Before he could ask, the Archon woman raised her hand, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. The room began to shift, changing in ways that defied logic. The walls seemed to warp and twist, becoming fluid, and the air grew thick with an unsettling pressure. Now comes the final part of your test, she announced. This is where your true strength will be revealed. Prepare yourselves, for the twist is not yet finished. Carter's pulse quickened. There had been a twist in the test already, but this, whatever was coming next, promised to be far worse. The room shifted once more, the walls twisting and bending as though reality itself were warping. Carter felt a strange pressure build in his chest, and the air grew colder. The Archon woman remained calm, her golden eyes now glowing with an intense, otherworldly light. It was as if she were waiting for something, waiting for them to make their move. Her words hung in the air, still echoing in his mind. Prepare yourselves, for the twist is not yet finished. Carter's heart raced. This test, whatever it was, had already pushed him to his limits. First, the cube, then facing his deepest fears. The mysterious future version of himself had only added to the confusion, and now they were standing on the edge of something much larger. There was no turning back. His crew, Patel, Hayes, and Jackson, stood at his side, their expressions a mixture of fear and determination. The silence that had fallen over them was thick, almost suffocating. They were all waiting for the next part of the test, but none of them knew what it would be. The tension was almost unbearable. "What's next?" Patil asked, her voice steady but strained. "What are we supposed to do?" The Arkan woman gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You will soon understand." With a flick of her hand, the air seemed to ripple. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the walls stretched and twisted, dissolving into the air like mist. It was as if the temple was transforming, changing into something entirely new, something more hostile. In the blink of an eye, the space around them shifted into a vast, open battlefield. The ground was jagged, the sky dark and swirling with unnatural clouds. Far off in the distance, Carter could see shapes moving. Creatures, no doubt, but they were unlike anything he had seen before. They were enormous, hulking figures, with eyes that gleamed red and glowed in the darkness. Their forms were twisted and unnatural, like shadows made flesh. The Arkan woman stepped forward, her voice breaking through the sudden chaos. "This is the final phase of your test. You will face what you fear the most. What lies beyond this field will be the ultimate challenge. The final confrontation is not against the creatures you see before you, but against something much deeper. It is the ultimate test of your will." Carter clenched his fists. He had faced his fear before, but this was different. There was no room for error now. The creatures in front of them weren't just manifestations of their minds. They were real, dangerous, and seemingly unstoppable. "We don't have much time," Hayes said, his voice low. "What's our plan?" "Stay together," Carter said firmly, though his mind was racing. "We've already overcome the first two parts of the test. This is no different. We'll face it as a team." Patel nodded, but Carter could see the fear in her eyes. The rest of the crew was clearly shaken by the looming threat. Jackson, always the soldier, was already checking his equipment, silently preparing for the fight that was coming. They started to move, slowly at first, their footsteps echoing in the strange silence of the battlefield. The ground beneath them was cracked, and strange, pulsating lights glowed from the fissures, casting eerie shadows that seemed to follow their every move. The sky overhead churned like a storm, lightning crackling in the distance. "Focus," Carter said, his voice steady. "Keep your eyes on the prize. We're here to prove we belong, to show them we are worthy." As they moved forward, the creatures in the distance began to stir. At first, they seemed content to watch, their glowing red eyes trained on the crew as they made their way across the battlefield. But then, without warning, the creatures started to advance. Their massive feet pounded the earth, sending shockwaves through the ground. "Get ready," Carter shouted, drawing his weapon. "This is it." The first creature reached them, a hulking behemoth that towered over them. Its body was covered in thick, armored plates, and it had 4 arms, each one ending in claws large enough to crush a car. Its eyes were pure red, filled with a bloodthirsty hunger. Carter didn't wait. He aimed his weapon and fired. The blast hit the creature square in the chest, but it barely seemed to notice. It roared, a deafening sound that echoed through the battlefield, and swung its massive arm toward Carter. He barely managed to duck, the clawed limb grazing his shoulder and sending him tumbling to the ground. His head spun, and for a moment, he thought he might lose consciousness. "Commander," Patil screamed, rushing to his side. But Carter quickly pushed himself to his feet. He had no time to waste. The creature was still coming, and it was faster than he had expected. He grabbed his weapon and fired again, aiming for the creature's eyes. This time, the blast hit its mark, and the creature howled in pain, staggering backward. "Keep it up," Carter shouted, rallying his team. "We can take it down." Hayes and Jackson opened fire, their weapons sending shots flying toward the beast. But it wasn't just the creatures they were fighting. The battlefield itself seemed to be fighting them, shifting underfoot, making it harder to stay steady. Strange energy fields crackled in the air, and the ground seemed to swallow their footsteps, as if the very earth was conspiring against them. But they didn't give up. The Arkan woman's words echoed in Carter's mind. "You will face what you fear the most." This wasn't just a physical battle. It was a test of their resolve. They couldn't let fear control them. They had to push forward, no matter what. The battle raged on, the creatures relentless. Carter's team moved as one, their training and teamwork evident in every move. But despite their best efforts, the creatures kept coming, growing more and more aggressive with each passing moment. It was clear that they weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting for something greater. The fate of humanity, perhaps, or maybe the test itself. Carter's breath was ragged, his body aching, but he kept fighting. He couldn't stop now. He couldn't let his crew down.